Thank you for attending today's webinar on compensation management. The focus of this presentation will be on challenges that you'll face in an evolving business climate. After viewing this webinar, you should be well prepared for the upcoming compensation cycle, be able to align cleanly to your business's strategic needs, and ultimately set yourself up for success in the upcoming fiscal year. After a brief introduction, we'll examine some of the key strategic business drivers in the market today. After that, we'll examine some of the key considerations for your upcoming compensation management cycle. And then finally, we'll look a little bit into the future. To provide a little context about who I am, I've built, grown, and transformed organizations of all sizes. In these leadership roles, I was responsible for organization and compensation design from smaller companies trying to go public all the way to giant, mature organizations looking to innovate, such as Thomson Corporation and ADP. In addition to introducing agile software development to ADP in the mid-2000s, I subsequently led the consulting teams that built the first data and predictive analytics products. Getting ahead of the curve in these and other areas have led to a number of invitations to speak at various industry conferences. My hope is that today you'll benefit from my business, human capital management, and technology background to really have a firm grasp on what needs to happen in your upcoming compensation management cycle. Thanks for your attention, and let's get started. We're going to start by examining key business drivers that are changing the business landscape today. The very traditional workforce of the past featured employees located in the same buildings together, working on very narrowly defined jobs with very specific reporting hierarchies and rigid systems and processes in place. This model has proven completely ill-suited to the modern business climate. We'll be examining the needs of both organizations and workers. These drivers will have a direct impact on the need for a better way to manage compensation today and in the future. The first business driver we'll be examining is a distributed workforce. This distributed workforce is supported by both technologies and practices of organizations that enable workers to work almost anywhere at almost any time. Some of these technologies include virtual workspaces, which enable collaboration between both internal team members and external third parties like vendors and customers. This collaboration can also include video presence, which reduces friction of these virtual meetings. This technology is very inexpensive and pervasive at this point. With technology vendors adopting cloud models, that eliminates the need for IT to do installation of software, which can take hours, days, or even weeks. This immediate ability to form a team, add to the team, and change a team is key to organizations that need agility, flexibility, and responsiveness. While nothing truly beats face-to-face collaboration, using telepresence and other technologies reduces the friction of these remote teams collaborating effectively, solving problems, and delivering business results. The ability to work remotely and even collaborate is really nothing new. For decades, organizations have allowed key contributors to work outside of the confines of the buildings where the traditional workforce was housed. The technology to support these remote workers was fairly primitive at first and certainly not cost effective. Think about dialing in with a modem to get to the corporate network. Fast forward to today, solutions are much less expensive, very pervasive, and improving each and every day. All these factors make it much more attractive for a modern enterprise to adopt a distributed workforce to help it succeed. So what's the impact of all of these trends? First of all, having a distributed workforce will become more of the rule than the exception in many organizations, since half of the workforce will very soon be remote. With so many remote workers, organizations will naturally gravitate towards results-based compensation as opposed to subjective measures based upon having individuals within a line of sight of supervisors. Supporting this linkage to results requires a number of things. Firstly, the structure needs to be adaptable to the individual situation. Secondly, the processes for review need to be efficient. And lastly, systems must be integrated to support these processes and the various structures that need to be put into place to support results-based compensation. These systems must be secure, provide transparency to all the parties that are involved, and support the efficient use of processes and the technology investments made by the organization. Now let's take a look at the impact of a distributed workforce on the workers themselves. As the survey illustrates, clearly there's a preference towards being given a choice of both the location and the time frame that the person works. But most importantly, what's valued is that the evaluation of employees is based on the results they deliver and not on how they actually perform the work. Fortunately, this directly aligns to the employer side, which seeks to obtain results rather than monitoring the actual activities being performed and the manner in which these tasks are being completed. To summarize the clear trend, both employers and workers have expressed a strong desire to move to a model where both the evaluation and the resulting compensation are driven not by low-level work and the manner in which it's performed, but rather by the business results that are achieved. Our next major strategic driver is the use of contract workers. Contracting workout is nothing new, and it was really part of the Industrial Revolution where piecework was farmed out to individuals who work primarily in their homes. Currently, contractors are used extensively. Roughly about a third of the workforce operates as contractors. Some institutions like Google actually currently have more contractors than full-time employees. Overall, what's projected is an inflection point roughly in 2027 where the majority of the U.S. workforce will actually be contractors rather than full-time employees. So clearly this trend will continue unabated and therefore become increasingly important as we look at how our workforce is compensated and therefore motivated. Compensating contract workers has proven to be a challenge in many organizations. Personally, I really didn't have that problem in building consulting, software product organizations, and even internal groups, which use lots of contractors. And the key in doing that, in my experience, was treating contractors and employees in a similar fashion. As we discussed previously, being goal-directed and results-oriented aligns a workforce to the needs of the organization, regardless of their employment status. So in other words, if you treat a contractor much as you do an employee and treat the payroll versus 1099 mechanism as a payment method as opposed to defining the relationship, you can better manage the people and use compensation as a motivator. Many leading-edge organizations today have already figured this out. For example, Uber and Lyft provide bonuses to their workforce, which is entirely contract-based. Variable compensation for contractors is, again, nothing new. There are numerous organizations that do not have their own sales force. Working with sales partners and manufacturers' reps is their only method of generating revenue, so those people are critical. Their variable compensation can include bonuses and other incentives, and there's also rewards and recognition that occur even though those people aren't full-time employees. Taking it one step further, results-based compensation can also be applied to contract workforces. In my own experience in the consulting world, working with state-owned enterprises and newly privatized companies in emerging markets, results-based compensation was used very effectively to control deadlines, project cost, and ensure quality. So this model works for organizations that are smaller all the way up to the largest defense contractors to align efforts to results. This brings us to our third major business driver, and that's the proliferation of business objectives. In addition to overall business goals and business unit objectives, different departments can have their own objectives. Furthermore, individual managers may have specific objectives that they need to accomplish. That makes alignment exceedingly difficult when you have the proliferation of business objectives put forth by multiple different stakeholders, often at various levels within an organization. At the business level, there are many different ways to measure the achievement of business objectives. Some are quite simple, some are very complex, but the good thing is that most of them can be used to drive both compensation and behavior all the way down to the individual contributor level. Further adding to this complexity is when you have shared business objectives that traverse organizational silos. And this is commonplace when you have cross-functional teams working on strategic goals that transcend departmental objectives. Now, what does that do to the compensation picture? Well, it requires that an individual's compensation have many different components which are driven by aspects across the organization. The last trend we'll examine today is that of multifaceted responsibilities. So workers today are no longer pigeonholed into a single task-oriented responsibility. Rather, they have a multitude of responsibilities, sometimes across the organization and outside of the departments they work in. This is true with even the largest organizations, which oftentimes have cross-functional teams. So those responsibilities really traverse the former organizational boundaries that you'd see in traditional organizations. In addition to this aspect of the trend towards multifaceted responsibilities, the jobs themselves are continuing to evolve. Manufacturing is probably most illustrative. In discussions I've had with numerous executives in this industry segment, they've said that yes, indeed, they are hiring. They're finding that they have to reskill their existing employees and sometimes train new employees and contractors because the work no longer involves assembly and pure manual labor. In fact, it involves more of the former white-collar types of activities, including robotics and additive manufacturing. Lastly, new jobs continue to be invented. This has created issues for economists and even HR organizations as they seek to classify these new jobs, sometimes into the existing rigid structures. To give you the perfect example, a few years ago there was no such thing as a data scientist, but now it's one of the hot jobs out there that pays really well and people aspire to. So what does this all mean from a compensation management perspective? Well, it's clear that the older rigid models and the processes and systems that support them are lagging behind the current trends around responsibilities and the compensation for them. Even the more commonplace areas of soft skills in terms of being able to measure and compensate in those areas is lacking in some of the legacy technologies and rigid systems. As the responsibilities of employees continue to change and they have more and more objectives that they must achieve, the compensation becomes more and more personalized. In fact, in many instances, each individual has a compensation structure which is unique to them. This trend is unlikely to abate. Surveys have shown that employees have a strong preference to individualized compensation. That's a great thing from a business perspective. It takes business alignment right down to the individual contributor level, both from a strategic perspective and with departmental objectives down to a tactical level. This comes at the expense of complexity in terms of managing compensation and the pressure it puts on legacy processes and systems. We've just examined 4 important drivers that impact compensation management. There are other factors, but they're all making compensation and the management of compensation that much more complex. The need for flexibility in processes, systems, and underlying technology will continue to grow as the trend of multifaceted and individualized compensation continues to evolve and grow. And if you look at forecasts around budget allocated to variable pay, that will continue to put pressure on legacy and outdated processes and systems. Finally, there's a macroeconomic factor that makes compensation management so important. The ongoing tightness in the labor market makes retention exceedingly important. While there are many other factors that drive retention, compensation tends to be at the top of the list in many organizations. So the obvious implication there is that because employees care so much about compensation, effective compensation management is critical to retention, which itself is critical to success in almost every organization you can think of. Now that we've covered some of the macro level drivers, let's talk a bit about specifics around what needs to happen in a compensation management program to address the changing landscape of compensation and the growing need for flexibility. The foundation for any major business function is the set of business processes that implement that function. Immature business processes take inefficient ad hoc behavior and force too rigid a system onto those behaviors. A mature and effective set of business processes are flexible enough to enable people in different functions at different levels in the organizations and in different geographies in an organization to effectively accomplish what they need to do. In addition to the core process of entering the upcoming changes in compensation, there are also the approval processes. These can vary in complexity and include multiple levels of approvals, plus flexible approval routing, where two or more people out of a group may have to approve a given merit increase before it moves forward. And the last aspect of business process management is transparency of process state. And all that means is that it should be a simple task to find out where a given request exists in the workflow and who's currently responsible for advancing it to the next step. For anything but the smallest organizations, automation should be applied for these end-to-end processes. It makes it efficient, effective, and it should be secure. To that end, spreadsheets should be avoided at all costs. There are numerous reasons, but main ones include the fact that spreadsheets are notoriously error-prone. They're obviously not secure and generally a source for accidental disclosure, meaning your data spills into the wrong hands. Finally, while it may be quick and dirty to set up a spreadsheet, maintaining it on an ongoing basis is labor intensive, which means that there's lots of hidden cost in keeping those spreadsheets alive from year to year. So hopefully no one out there is using spreadsheets currently. From the system perspective, what should we expect from a user experience perspective? User experience is important because compensation management is typically not a continuous process. It's specialized. Oftentimes it's only annual, so getting it right without having to refer to a manual or asking an expert or calling IT is really important. The system should implement process. While that sounds patently obvious, what often happens is that organizations create process around the system rather than having the system implement their chosen efficient process. The system should also be clean. While that's a fairly nebulous term, in practice it means that the user interface should be easy to understand, simple to use, and more importantly from a data perspective, it should be easy to enter and change the data over time. This isn't something you typically see in a demo of a system, but it's very important. How do you make changes to data that has moved through the process? How do you handle any of those exception cases? Can you do it within the system, Or do you have to involve a database administrator or IT or the vendor to make that change? Obviously, timeliness and accuracy of the compensation cycle is of the essence. So make sure you focus on this when you take a look at what the user experience looks like when it comes to exception processes. Lastly, you want compensation management to be focused on compensation management, not bolted onto other functionality where users once a year have to dig through menus or navigate through a convoluted system to do what they have to do. Because this happens infrequently, users should be able to quickly navigate to where they need to go, perform the exact task required, and then subsequently be able to monitor the status of the workflows. Compensation management should drive organizational alignment and provide transparency. Compensation management systems should implement a number of basic functions. Firstly, objectives need to be flexible and should be visible in one place. The linkage of any compensation should clearly tie back to those objectives. Managers should have a complete view of their organization. Again, this should include contractors, and it may differ from what's inside the HRIS. So your span of control from a compensation perspective may be different than the reporting lines that are established in your HRIS system of record. While email notifications of workflow status change are fine, email should not be the underlying workflow platform. Now, this may sound stupid, but total comp statement should reflect total compensation. So that means every aspect of the compensation plan and the increase process should be reflected in those reports. And lastly, an audit trail is absolutely essential. It should be complete and it should be irrefutable. As we discussed previously, flexibility can be very difficult because aligning different interests across the organization to achieve strategic business objectives requires balancing competing interests in a way that's fair, but most importantly, that achieves the overall goals of the company and motivates people to do the right things for the company so that you don't require supervision. It becomes inherent in the behavior of people across the organization. One very practical consideration is the longevity of the model. You can't, in essence, keep moving the goalposts around because that generally does not drive effective behavior. It creates inaction because of uncertainty. And you can see that across many different industries and organizations of all sizes. Constantly changing strategies can create paralysis in an organization. So lastly, trying to use spreadsheets to manage flexible compensation and merit increases is just not effective. We talked about this before, but I can't emphasize this more strongly. So assuming you're not going to use spreadsheets to manage flexible compensation and merit increases, what's important from a technology perspective? Well, the first thing is integration. In almost no instance is there one and only one HR system in an organization, whether they are formal HR systems or they are homegrown things that grew up in some corner of the organization that support that function. Therefore, you must have solid integration capabilities because it's likely you'll have multiple systems of record. And the statistics bear this out. And I guess in an HR context, we're lucky because we don't have as many systems of record as some other parts of the organization like learning and development. The second thing that's important is as we become more data-driven as organizations, the thirst for information is increasing. So that includes the HR domain. So there's a need to surface that data, integrate it with other data sources in a semantically consistent manner, meaning it means the same thing across the organization, so that senior executives can include human capital as one of the things they look at in making strategic decisions. The third thing that's important to consider is that implementing cloud-based systems deliver much better ROI than their counterparts that are delivered on-premise. The other thing that's important about that is it requires less involvement from IT, which is a scarce resource in most organizations, and the implementation time tends to be a lot shorter. Lastly, when you go to a cloud system, just make sure that you're obtaining elastic pricing, which is based on the actual number of people that you're covering, as opposed to some flat fee that may perpetuate long into the future, or that doesn't necessarily reflect your actual usage patterns. We've talked in broad strokes about what functionality needs to be in a compensation management system. Let's boil this down into some specific criteria that you can use to evaluate technology solutions in compensation management to determine the suitability of that solution to your organization. The first thing is the ability to cascade goals down from the top level strategic drivers through multiple organizational levels. Again, that's that notion of alignment. The second thing is the flexibility to use different types of inputs to drive your compensation cycle. These can be quantitative factors such as ratings, percentage achievements, scorecards, or they can be things that are far more subjective. The third criteria is the suitability to reward everyone from senior executives down to individual contributors, including contractors, based on individual achievement. And again, that's consistent with that trend that we examined around the need for both organizations and the workforce to have more individualized and potentially unique compensation while still maintaining alignment with organizational goals. The fourth thing is the ability to vary compensation based on levels of goal achievement. So it's not just all or nothing or even a calculated percentage. It can be buckets like quintiles. But in any case, it needs to reflect how organizations want to manage compensation as opposed to force-fitting the reward mechanism into what a system can deliver. So the fifth criteria is a little more nuanced. We already talked about the ability to support subjective goals, but in this case, it's the ability to examine the input to that rating so that the leaders can make a valid determination as opposed to having to hunt through emails or look in other systems to surface that information and make that decision. Finally, consistent with that notion of transparency is that feedback loop mechanism so that the leaders and the people that they are rating have the ability to understand where that rating and therefore that change in compensation came from. Again, it's that notion of fairness and transparency that is increasingly important in most workforces. This next section will provide a few illustrative examples to make what we've been talking about a little more concrete. In this example, a regional bank had to balance the needs of the overall organization with those of the individual branches. Equity across the bank was critical to ensure fairness. The use of spreadsheets made enforcement of equitable distribution impossible, and in addition, numerous errors popped up throughout the compensation cycle. The spreadsheet-based process was obviously highly fragmented. On an annual basis, the executive team defined the incentive plans and allocated budget against those plans. The accounting team used multiple spreadsheets for each incentive program and entered the achievements against the objectives. The HR team was responsible for individual targets based on the person's level within the organization. The results were put into one master spreadsheet. Then in a process known as scatter-gather, the master spreadsheet was broken up into individual spreadsheets distributed to managers for review, potential revision, and approval. The spreadsheets were then emailed back to HR, who reassembled them into a master spreadsheet, and then manual input into the payroll system commenced. This process proved error-prone, inefficient, costly, and lacked visibility throughout the process, making it very, very painful for everyone involved. The automated solution started off in a similar fashion, with the executive team defining the incentive plans and the budget allocations for each. However, the accounting team now operated on a single set of information which was visible across the organization and flowed smoothly right to HR. That's because the HR team used the same single system, and they too shared a single set of information with each of the individual managers. This enabled managers to stay within their budgetary targets with updates in real time as they entered changes to the compensation they were doling out. Role-based security ensured that managers were also managing the compensation of their indirect reports. One very important aspect of the solution was the automated feed to payroll. This eliminated the errors in compensation due to data entry errors from rekeying data into payroll manually. In addition to incentive compensation, the system was also used for merit increases. So managers gained increased visibility to all aspects of both merit and incentive compensation, and those views rolled up throughout the organizational hierarchy all the way up to the senior executive level. It was a big win for the HR organization. This global electronics company is probably an even worse example. This organization had multiple incentive plans that went down to the individual level with goals that were both quantitative and qualitative. The employees, unfortunately, had no visibility into either the process or the underlying metrics that were driving their compensation. The system was built in-house on an antiquated platform that was no longer supported by the vendor. Even worse, there were no developers left in-house familiar with the system to make any changes or updates to it. To keep things running each year, the organization used manual processes and little spreadsheets to fill in the gaps where there was no functionality available in the current system. In the comprehensive solution, administrators start by defining the bonus programs. After that, goals are entered. Plans are completely transparent. Feedback loops between managers and individuals are visible throughout the year. Managers enter achievements which automatically calculate and update the display in real time. Both administrators and executives have full transparency. They see a holistic view of the process. Once again, this was a big win for the HR organization who solved a problem that was visible throughout the organization and was a big pain point every year. In this final section, we'll briefly look at some of the future considerations for compensation management. These considerations, while nice to have today, will become more prominent in the future. The first thing that will be prominent in the future is the increased emphasis on total rewards. This is primarily the focus of the younger part of the workforce, but it will become increasingly more prominent. This will necessitate a tilt towards total rewards in favor of simple compensation. The second area of growing prominence is the consumerization of IT. Now, this is occurring across the technology market, but corporate and enterprise software can no longer be substandard vis-a-vis technology that you get on your phones or in your home. The third major area of prominence comes from the changing relationship in the workforce. The move towards continuous feedback, while slow, continues onward. Capturing this as part of the compensation management process will become increasingly important as workers now expect more frequent dialogue around progress and expectations that just can't happen at an annual review. The final area of prominence occurs across the technology landscape, and that's one of supporting data-driven decision-making. This is supported by analytics in the underlying technology platform. So it incorporates data, the enrichment of the data, such as the continuous feedback that we talked about. These sources, in addition to external sources, amalgamated together, lead to better HR data presentation and decision making. This is a trend across the industry and all the vendors are jumping in there. So that's something that you should be keenly aware of when it comes to this realm. Compensation management data, of course, is a key part of the overall human capital management domain, which should be an essential part of any analytics used at the executive level. So in summary, these factors that we listed that are nice to have today will definitively become prominent in the future. So as you're evaluating your compensation management strategy, the processes and technology you choose to support that strategy, please bear in mind the trends we talked about today, the needs that you have to serve today, and those factors that will be prominent in the future. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I do hope this was of great value to you.